Thank you for coming. Before I start, I wanted to do a little poll of the audience. So raise your hand if you have a child who's 2 and under. Wow, awesome. Okay, how about, congratulations, 5 and under. Anybody? Okay, under 12? Okay, excellent. So I'm Jenn Greenaway, and I'm going to be talking about some of the things that I geek out about, which is a little different from most of the tracks you see at Scale. So I'm going to talk about child development, brain science, and creativity. So in addition to being a fan of open source, which brings me to Scale, I'm also a teacher for the Conejo Valley Unified School District, and I'm currently working with infants and toddlers. So I'm immersed in supporting the growth and development of super smart people every day. This is my first presentation at Scale, so I'm going to ask you to keep the heckling to a minimum. So let's get started. Before we begin, a spoiler alert, your baby can't hack. I'm sorry if you are being disillusioned right now. Your baby probably shouldn't be hacking. And we'll talk a little bit more about this, but I like to explain the title for anybody who's here by mistake and wants to leave now. So I am titled the talk as a bit of a parody on the program Your Baby Can Read, which kind of fools really well-intentioned people into buying things to teach their child to read before they're 2. Because babies, like, they can't hack, they also can't read. They can recognize symbols, so they understand that a picture of a cat represents an actual cat, and they can learn rapidly that signed or spoken words represent ideas and real things. So when prompted, like babies tend to be prompted quite a bit, they can identify things like cats, dogs, grandma, even specific letters or sight words with enough practice with Your Baby Can Read. But this is an actual reading, and that's a more sophisticated and nuanced task that children really aren't ready for until about 7 or 8 years old. So I'm not going to talk at length about this because it's not that exciting, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention the negative effects of screen media on children's development. So for starters, it can really impact sleep, which is an important topic for any parent in the room who has a child under the age of 2. So it's been found that the artificial light that's produced by screens actually reduces the production of melatonin. For those of you in the room without children who spend long hours at your computer, that might be a topic of interest to you as well. So researchers at Florence University actually found that children's melatonin production was reduced by 30% after watching screen media, which is pretty significant. And it specifically hinders their REM sleep, which is responsible for dreaming, for long-term memory formation, and for supporting their emotional maturation. Additionally, the risks of language delay is pretty significant because babies can literally only learn language from a real face. There's been numerous studies done tracking their learning through videos and other forms of screen media, and they actually can only learn language, learn to speak, by watching a human face. So that's pretty important. And the average child is exposed to about 4 hours of screen media every day. So screen media is not limited to television. That includes your smartphones, your iPads, your Android tablets. Even if it's open source, it can be negative. So watching TV or playing video games specifically hundreds of times per week, their brains can be artificially jerked between the fight or flight instinct. Comes from their adrenal glands. Thank you, Phil. And prompts the brain to produce norepinephrine and dopamine. So this causes things like hypervigilance, tension, dry mouth, clammy hands, and increased heart rate and blood pressure. And what a flood of cortisol does to your brain is it restricts your ability to access the upper part of your brain. And the upper regions of the brain are where your planning, cooperation, empathy, compassion, and systematic thinking have evolved. So when you're flooding the brain with cortisol, your neural processes are dominated by the lower part of your brain, the less evolved centers, where your more instinctual responses reside. So adult brains go through the same type of thing when you're playing your Xbox or you're watching a really action-packed movie. But the difference is that a child's brain chemistry can actually be permanently adapted due to this. So it's important to understand that the overdose of the stress hormones can have a long-term impact. There's a Dr. Leonard Eron from the University of Illinois, who observed a group of young people up until the age of 30. And those who watched the most screen media were more likely to show heightened aggression and were more likely to be arrested for criminal acts as adults. So that was your upper for the start of the presentation. Here's the bottom, the bottom line from the American Academy of Pediatrics. Television and other entertainment media should be avoided for infants and children under age 2. A child's brain develops rapidly during these first years, and young children learn best by interacting with people, not screens. So we know that we want children to develop the healthiest, most efficient brains possible so they can be their best possible geeks. And by the age of 3, 85 to 90% of your child's core brain structures have developed. This is the foundation for all later learning, and that's a pretty short window of time when you think about it. Alison Gopnik is a scientist at UC Berkeley who's done some really fascinating studies on cognitive development, and she's written 2 books that I would like to recommend. One, The Scientist in the Crib, and the other, The Philosophical Baby. So she describes infant brains in a really interesting way as compared to adults. So she describes infants as lanterns, while adults are spotlights. So what that means is we are mostly conscious of what we pay attention to, because over time, we've grown to have chemicals in our brain that help us to literally screen out distractions. So, for example, adults can work with the TV on, music playing, they're on their cell phone, people are talking around them, and they're using the chemicals in their brain to screen out all of the distractions so they can actually focus on things while they're doing this. Some adults do it better than others, obviously. But infants don't have the ability to do this. So they don't have the chemicals to screen things out, and they're literally aware of everything around them. So anyone who has ever tried to put a baby to sleep knows what I'm talking about, because the smallest thing can distract them because they're paying attention to everything. So there are critical periods of development for various systems. For example, speech and language develop between 1 and 3 years of age. Between the ages of 1 and 4, children develop the capacity to understand logic and mathematics. This doesn't mean that between the ages of 1 and 4, children are learning all the math that they're going to use for the rest of their life, but it's the foundation. So if those capabilities are not exercised during that time, the child will have a harder time with those concepts later on. So knowing all of these things, I wanted to ask some questions about technology. So I asked, what skills are of value in technology today? How do children acquire those skills? And how is free and open source software suited to foster the development of these skills? So I put together an interview pool, and the picture here is not in any way representative of the people that I interviewed. So I interviewed both men and women. It doesn't represent Gareth, no. So I interviewed both men and women, and across the board I got a lot of really similar responses, which is what I was kind of hoping for. So first, let's talk about the skills that were said to be of particular value within the field of technology. So people responded saying that the things that they're looking for are personality, experience, the ability to write, creative thinking, risk-taking, artistry, flexibility, creativity, problem-solving. The words that came up the most involved creativity or creative thinking, and an ability to solve problems creatively or to think outside the box. These are skills that are valued in a lot of fields, but ironically they're skills that are on the decline, and it's become something of a crisis. People often are talking about the current creativity crisis in our society, and a lot of people within my field point the finger at technology. They say that as our kids are growing up tethered to their media, creativity is being sacrificed, and children have less time for the things that help them to be creative people. But I believe, living in a household with an open source enthusiast and observing his creativity and passion for technology, it's not that simple. It's what technology we're using and how and when we're using it. This is a quote from my husband, Gareth, and when I originally put my slides together, I had not attributed this to him, so I want to be sure to mention that this was said by him. He was one of my interview subjects, and this is what he had to say when I asked about the specific skills and attributes that he looks for when he's looking for people to work with. and he said he looks for the ability to experiment and not be afraid of breaking things. Oftentimes, I find people who are unable to start a project or process without a set of steps they need to follow to the letter. So I pulled this out because I think it highlights the kind of thinking that we may be creating in our homes and schools, leading to the creativity crisis. It speaks to the kind of regimented, by the book, spoon-fed, teach to the test learning marketed by programs like Your Baby Can Read. It's rare to meet a 2-year-old who is unable to start a project without having a set of steps outlined in front of them. A 2-year-old can decide that they're going to empty an entire sandbox, gather up some tools to do it, and have it done before you can finish a cup of coffee. It's unfortunately increasingly common to come in contact with a 4-year-old who's unable to start something because they're afraid they're going to do it wrong, or they can't think of where to begin, or they need someone to show them how to do it. Luckily for all of us, we have a very clear roadmap to promoting the kind of creative thinking and problem solving that children will need to succeed. If your child has attended preschool and you've had a chance to hear about play-based curriculum, this will all be familiar to you. You'll recognize all the concepts. So these are really things that you can do to foster creative thinking and problem solving, not only in children, but in the other people around you. So open-ended questions, that's a question that doesn't have a yes or no answer. It's not right, it's not wrong. So you can promote a lot of learning that way. So an example of an open-ended question would be, what should we do first? What comes next? What's another way? These are questions you hear a lot in the open source community. So they're really good questions for your coworkers and peers as well. Open-ended materials are materials that can be used in multiple ways. They're cheap and readily available, and babies and toddlers are exceptional at finding them for you. Tupperware, empty boxes, scarves, blankets, anything like that. But you can also buy them, building materials, art supplies, toys that can be used in different ways, anything that doesn't have a prescribed use. Giving them opportunities to succeed and fail. This is really difficult for parents to do because you want your child to succeed and you want them to get it right. But I think open source software is a model for this kind of thinking because it's always undergoing changes, it's always open to criticisms in the form of bug reports. So maybe keep that in the back of your mind. And it's important that we value the process of getting somewhere and not just the product that we produce in the end. Free time, free as in freedom time. Time that doesn't have an objective or an agenda. We're going to talk more about that in a minute. And also by modeling these skills yourself, which if you're working in the open source community, you're probably doing without even knowing it. So fostering these types of skills in children is not a complicated process, but it gets complicated when we get in the way of their real learning experiences, and we're really good at doing that. Children learn through play. This is a well-documented fact. According to Dietz and Cashin in the book Playing and Learning, they say, in order for an activity to be considered play, the experience must include a measure of inner control, ability to bend or invent reality, and a strong internally based motivation for playing. If parents and educators try to label experiences as play, but in reality they have specific requirements for the activity, then it becomes work, not play. I think that anyone who has a job may understand what they're talking about. For example, it's impossible to play with flashcards when your purpose is to have a child memorize something on each card, because children quickly differentiate between what is work and what is play. Child development theorist Vygotsky, who's quoted here, was a Russian psychologist who introduced what is known as the zone of proximal development. And what that is the difference between what a learner can do without help versus what they can do with help. So an example would be when a child is working on a puzzle, and as an observer, I see that if they could shift the piece a little bit to the left, it would fit in perfectly. But anybody who's ever watched a little kid struggling with a puzzle, you know that it's really hard to get that piece in there right, and it's really hard for the adult not to jump in and do it for them. But they just haven't figured it out yet. So you might just suggest to them, what happens if you turn it a little bit? And then they discover that they can apply that same strategy to piece after piece, and that pushes them closer to the edge of their zone of proximal development. So the zone of proximal development describes functions that have not matured yet, but are in the active process of maturing. And Vygotsky believed that children really learn the best through play and that during play, particularly fantasy play, a child is always at their peak zone of proximal development, standing taller than themselves. So I asked my interview subjects what their favorite toys were when they were growing up. And those that did mention computers talked about learning to write simple programs, using them to write short stories, and playing simple games. The majority of my interview subjects expressed that they did not take an interest in computers until about the age of 10 or 11. You'll remember that 85 to 90% of a child's core brain structure is established by the time they're 3. And at the age of 5, they've already passed the critical phases of development that will have laid the groundwork for logic and mathematics. So we can conclude that age 10 or 11 seems like a pretty safe time for them to start exploring computers. Most of them talked about Legos, Tinker Toys, and other open-ended things. This is Bloom's Taxonomy, which is a classification of learning objectives within education that was designed by Benjamin Bloom. And it explains the order in which higher thinking unfolds. So starting at the bottom, first you need to be able to remember things, remember information, before you can move on to understanding it. You need to hold an idea in your mind before you can delve deeper into it. Then you can begin to apply this information. And when you can begin to apply it, you can create something, evaluate it, analyze it. In the book Teaching Strategies, Donald Orlock explains creative thinking as combining parts to constitute a pattern or structure that didn't exist before, something that someone might do with Legos. And I think this definition applies to what we're talking about. So this quote from Lloyd Alexander kind of applies to what I was talking about in terms of allowing children to succeed and fail. We learn more by looking for an answer to a question and not finding it than we do from learning the answer itself. Giving children the time to explore different paths and to explore the world around them is the most important thing that you can do. So I recently read an article that said that the skill required most in the workforce today is not actually problem solving, but problem finding, identifying things that need to be solved, and then later on figuring out how to solve them. And I think we can agree that that requires a significant amount of creative thinking and the unique perspective that's fostered by freedom and exploration. Now I'll talk about how FOSS, free and open source software, is uniquely suited to foster those skills of creative thinking and problem solving in children, as well as adults, as compared to closed and proprietary technology. And what better to represent closed and proprietary than an iPhone? I hope that I won't offend anyone by describing an iPhone as dumbed down technology. I think we can all appreciate the elegant design and the great technological strides that it took to reach the iPhone. But we can probably agree that devices like that have been specifically designed for ease of use. There was a video that was really popular online not long ago about a toddler who was trying to use a magazine as an iPad. I don't know if anybody saw that. They were swiping and swiping at the magazine, trying to bring out their app. And people who watched it thought it was hilarious. And they kind of laughed and talked about how kids today are born with iPads in their hands. They're digital natives. And we're so impressed when our kids can pick up our phone and navigate the apps easier and more intuitively than we can. But we really shouldn't be impressed or surprised because they've grown up with it. It's not complicated to use. And they observe us using it all the time, right? And it's less and less complicated every day. So the fear of a lot of parents that I've talked to is that their children need to be proficient in technology in order to be able to compete in the world today, to compete in school, to be ready for school, to be able to go out into the job force. So they tend to misdirect their attention to exposing their kids to technology at younger and younger ages, giving their preschoolers superhero and princess computers that drill them on finding letters on the keyboard so they'll be able to type. I don't know if you guys remember your typing classes in school, but it didn't really take that long to figure out the keyboard. And kids are really good observers. So they know how to do so many things with devices just by watching us do it. As an example, the children in my room at work are babies. And usually by the age of 1, they've figured out that the camera that we use in the classroom is a digital camera. And if I take a picture, they immediately want to see the back so they can look at the picture of themselves. And nobody's taught them about digital cameras. It's just the only thing that they've ever seen. and they're really good at figuring out cause and effect, and they expect to see the image on the back. My grandma learned to use a desktop computer in her late 70s, and learning to use a mouse was the biggest challenge that she faced, which I've heard is very common with elderly users. But once she got that down, she found it was all pretty simple, which is the goal of most technology on the surface. And I certainly appreciate that as one of the less technical people at this conference. So when I first started using Linux in the late 90s, I had a mouse pad that Gareth had given me that had a list of common command lines because they were necessary to know to do certain things on my computer. And so since I wasn't one of those kids whose favorite toy was a computer, it was like learning a foreign language to me. It was totally outside my comfort zone. But today, when you sit down at a desktop computer, as has been the goal in open source technology for a while, you can use Linux without even knowing that you're using Linux. But I reckon that if you're interested in hearing that your baby can hack, your goal is for them to understand a little bit more about the technology under an operating system and to understand what's going on under the hood of the computer. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the two different kinds of learning. The learning that I encourage in the course of my job is active learning. Because as we've already talked about, young children learn best through doing, through hands-on experiences. And depending upon your learning style, chances are good that you probably learn best the same way. It can also be described as meaningful learning, where rote learning is more about learning through memorization, which is the kind of learning we use when we learn phonics, the multiplication tables, the periodic table of elements, the kinds of things that you're continually drilled on until you have it embedded in your brain. So if you work in computer science or have studied it, you may be familiar with the term tabula rasa. Anybody heard that term? Thank you. It's also used in child development circles, which is something that I found out when I was doing a little research for my talk. I didn't realize it was used in computer science, but it basically means the same thing in both fields, blank slate. So it was one of the original theories of development years and years ago, and it's been pretty thoroughly debunked, but it still kind of tends to rear its head. So it's the idea that children are empty vessels or blank slates that we can fill up with knowledge. We can just pour our learning into them, and they'll be able to go out into the world knowing all the things that we've taught them. But what brain science shows us is that infants and young children actually have amazing brains. If our brains could work in the way that their brains work, we would be such smarter people. They have complex brains and really sophisticated ways of figuring things out. So in my work with infants and toddlers, I see them doing incredible things every day. They're always seeking patterns, making connections, solving problems, and experimenting with the results. We tend to overlook and underestimate their capacities because we're so distracted by their cuteness and all the demands of caring for them. But personally, I'm continually amazed by the way that they can make things happen if I'm able to just get out of their way. So many of the games and educational software programs for children involve rote learning. So a lot of game makers kind of stalled out on the same concept, which I imagine is somewhat frustrating to children because the way that a game traditionally works, children have to answer an equation or answer a question, do something right in order to move on to the next level. So the game makers tend to add things into the games to make them more appealing to kids. So they'll add characters, sound effects, all kinds of exciting things to keep them interested in the game, but they're really pretty much flashcards. And it's not inherently bad. And some things are really important to memorize. I'm not trying to put down the skill of memorization. In fact, it's kind of fallen out of favor since smartphones came along. When was the last time you had to remember a phone number off the top of your head? But what I'd like to encourage is that people will think critically about the kinds of educational games your child is playing and what true value they have underneath. Here is the Linux founder, Linus Torvalds, talking about the Linux philosophy. The Linux philosophy is laugh in the face of danger. Oops, wrong one. Do it yourself. So I once read an interview with Linus where he said, the thing is, I don't have a message to people. I never really did. I did and do Linux because it's fun and interesting. And I really also also enjoy the social aspect of developing things in the open. I don't really have anything that I want to tell people. But although Linus himself may not have had a message, the open source community seems to. What appeals to me as an educator and a human being is the openness and spirit of collaboration within the community. The fact that open source projects are always open to improvement and revision is a great message in and of itself, and that's a great message to spread to the next generation. And the spirit of open source speaks to the skills and values that our future geeks need to succeed. Creativity, flexibility, collaboration, thinking outside the box. I don't know if any of you guys were able to see any of the talks in the next generation track yesterday, but if you missed it, you should make a point of catching it next year, because it's very exciting to see all the kids showing off the things that they're passionate and excited about, and the things that they've learned by actively experimenting with open source. So Mitch Resnick from the MIT Media Lab talks about teaching young people to program the way that we teach them to read and write. Mozilla Executive Director Mark Thurman told Wired magazine that kids start deciding whether they're going to be content makers or consumers sometime around the age of 8 and 10 years old. If we want kids to be makers rather than consumers, which should be our goal, this is the critical age. This is a screenshot of Scratch, which is the programming language from Mitch Resnick and the Lifelong Kindergarten Group at the MIT Media Lab that allows children to create stories, animation, games, music, and art, and they can share them on the web and open them up to collaboration. Has anybody here used Scratch before? Awesome. Obviously. When I was at the Next Generation track yesterday, I was listening to a talk being given by Kayla Banks, which was outstanding, by the way. And the boy who was sitting next to me was using Scratch while Kayla was talking, which was very exciting to me. I don't know if that boy's in the room right now, but you're a rock star. So the Scratch website says, as young people create and share Scratch projects, they learn important mathematical and computational ideas, while also learning to think creatively, reason systematically, and work collaboratively. Like, how awesome is that? There's actually a book available at the Open Starch Press booth downstairs, and I'm not in any way affiliated with them. But I happened to notice yesterday that they had a book on Scratch. So if you want to get your kid interested in something like that, there's a good resource for you. HackAsaurus. Has anybody heard about HackAsaurus? Show of hands? No? I hadn't heard about it either. So I found it while I was researching good open source options for this talk. So HackAsaurus is an open source and open educational resource project from Mozilla with a code and curriculum that lets young people begin to play with digital content. So they've hosted events so far in New York and Chicago, and they're developing a HackAsaurus event kit so that anyone, anywhere can organize an event of their own, which any scale organizers in the room, you should take note of that. So Atul Varma is the technical lead, and he says public schools assume that kids are digital natives, so they don't need any kind of computer classes. But the kids we're talking to know how to use Facebook and nothing else. No offense, Phil. HackAsaurus isn't yet a project that your baby can hack on, but I wanted to talk about it because I love the ideas behind it, and I'm really curious to watch it develop because it's really reflective of do-it-yourself, hands-on learning. And it seems like just a really exciting thing to keep your eye on in the future. So I only have anecdotal evidence to back up this claim, but I am certain of the validity. TextPaint is one of the most popular open source programs for children of all ages. Who's used TextPaint? And is it fabulous? From a teaching perspective, it's a great program because it's very open-ended. It allows children to create their own projects and explore with different techniques. Last year, there were multiple TextPaint presentations in the Next Generation track, and they generated some of the most excitement in the crowd. Even though it would be, the second or third TextPaint presentation, it was just as exciting as the first time. Kids in the crowd were calling out suggestions. Try this tool, pick this color, do this, drag it over here. And they were actively collaborating on their projects as the talk unfolded. So if you do feel compelled to give your 3-year-old something to do at a computer, I would sit them down in front of TextPaint. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Sugar Learning Platform. Has anybody had the chance to visit the OLPC booth downstairs? No? None of you have been down to the Expo floor? The Sugar Learning Platform was originally designed for the One Laptop Per Child, or OLPC, netbook. but it can run on nearly any computer, which is something they're very proud of. And they've created some really wonderful, innovative programs for kids, parents, and educators. So this is a screenshot of Pippi, which is a program to teach young children Python, a programming language. And all of their activities are designed to encourage critical thinking, which is what is exciting to me. And I have another screenshot from Sugar Lab. There are elements that are great for kids, elements that are great for parents, and some that appeal particularly to teachers. So the makers of Sugar emphasize that it facilitates sharing and collaboration. And this is a screenshot of their journal. So the journal is an automated diary of everything the child has done on the computer, which sounds a little bit like you're spying on them or something. It's like tracking software. But it's actually a really interesting idea because they can go back and see not only what they did, but who it was shared with, when it happened, and they can kind of reflect on what they've worked on, or something that they haven't used in a while, or wow, I can't believe I spent that much time working on it. So it's a really interesting concept. So the One Laptop per Child project did a great experiment that involved leaving tablet devices in a sealed box in Ethiopia and seeing what the children did with them. So they literally left a box, taped shut, with tablets inside. And this is a quote from the leader of the project describing what happened. We left the boxes in the village, closed, taped shut, no instruction, no human being. I thought the kids will play with the boxes. Within 4 minutes, one kid had not only opened the box, but found the on and off switch. He'd never seen an on and off switch. He powered it up. Within 5 days, they were using 47 apps per child per day. Within 2 weeks, they were singing ABC songs in English in the village. Within 5 months, they had hacked Android. Some idiot in our organization or in the media lab had disabled the camera, and they figured out that it had a camera, and they hacked Android. That's pretty amazing. So this is from an article by Evan Ackerman on the Device website. What the OLPC project has realized over the last 5 or 6 years is that teaching kids stuff is really not that valuable. Yes, knowing all your state capitals and how to spell neighborhood properly and whatnot isn't a bad thing. But memorizing facts and procedures isn't going to inspire kids to go out and learn by teaching themselves, which is the key to good education. Instead, OLPC is trying to figure out a way to teach kids to learn, which is what this experiment is all about. So just to give you a sense of what these villages in Ethiopia are like, the kids and most of the adults there have never seen a word. No books, no newspapers, no street signs, no labels on packaged foods or goods, nothing. And these villages aren't unique in that respect. There are many of them in Africa where literacy is close to zero. So you might think that if you're going to give out fancy tablet computers, it would be helpful to have someone along to show them how to use them. But that's not what OLPC did. They left the boxes there, containing 1 tablet for every kid in each of the villages, nearly 1,000 tablets total, preloaded with a custom English language operating system, and SD cards that would track the software and record how the tablets were used. And they found the most amazing things. My niece, Grace, is 7. Like most 7-year-olds, she's ridiculously smart, sometimes too smart. And one of my favorite things that she's ever said was, "I know what you said, Mom, but can't we just Google it so I know you're right?" Grace has known about Google probably for all of her life, or that's how it feels. She's a classic example of the kids that we consider to be digital natives. But she doesn't know the first thing about hacking. And that's fine because she's more interested in drawing and singing and all of those good things. But it's interesting to consider the technical skills that we're making it possible for children to learn when they're born with smartphones in their hands. The experiment with OLPC reminded me about a study that I had heard about years ago that was evaluating the math competencies of children in certain cities and countries where the children were working on the streets selling goods. So these are children who had not attended school, they had no formal math training, and they didn't even know the words that represent numbers. They didn't know the words that represent math concepts whatsoever. But because they had developed really sophisticated understandings of counting, adding, subtracting, multiplication, skills more sophisticated than those of their peers who were sitting in classrooms all day. So they figured out their own system for keeping track of money, being able to give people change when they bought something, and so forth. Because they had to learn hands-on. some time ago, I read an article about a Waldorf School in Silicon Valley that does not use computers in the classroom. The majority of students who are attending the school are the children of highly technical people in the area, like an engineering manager at Cisco, who was quoted as saying, "They need the environment and the foundation to develop and get their core values, the love of education and their own passion. That's what's going to stay with them. The computer is just a tool." I apologize for saying that. So that's it. Thank you. I do have something else to say. I have some prizes. So I was planning to give them out to people who have questions. So if anybody has a question, you'll automatically get a prize. And if you don't, then we'll go from there. Yeah.
So, at the beginning, we talked about something really important, some new data and focus for me. So here's kind of let's dive into that a little bit. Did you find any research that shows a difference between what I call passive versus active interaction?
Yes.
For example, when our kid gets home, he's tired from daycare,
yes.
so maybe he just wants to throw in
Finding Nemo.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But a lot of times he'll spend like an hour interacting with the tablet he's got and he figured out the thing on my iPhone.
Right.